Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. A pastor in Calgary is appealing huge fines he and his brother received for breaking Alberta's COVID-19 pandemic rules. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson says Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is allegedly laying some of the blame for the province's COVID-19 response at the feet of Dr. Dina Hinshaw. And the Atlanta Braves win their first World Series championship in 26 years.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. A Calgary pastor and his brother are appealing stiff fines and other sanctions imposed after they were convicted of contempt for violating our province's COVID-19 rules. Pastor Arthur Pawlowski and his brother David say sanctions imposed last month were a violation of their charter rights. The Pawlowskis were fined a total of $53,000. As part of their probation, the two men were ordered to include in any public speeches criticizing COVID-19 measures that their views are contradicted by the majority of scientific opinion. The brothers earlier filed appeals of their convictions for civil contempt. You know, over the past few weeks, we've been bringing you stories of healthcare workers who are losing their jobs because of personal choices regarding vaccine mandates. We recently spoke with one Alberta man who's chosen to help and believes he has an innovative court strategy.
One of the things I do. So we talked about, okay, well, now I have some witnesses, I have evidence beyond just my information. We could file for an injunction. So we took this file, and one of the things that became obvious was that the best way to approach this was using something that I am an expert in, which is informed consent, because no matter whether you support what the government's doing, from masks to social distance and lockdowns or vaccines, or whether you're wholly against them. One of the things that is quite clear is everything that the public is doing, they're doing without informed consent.
David Dixon recently filed an injunction in the Court of Queen's Bench on behalf of healthcare workers in Alberta who are losing their jobs for not getting the jab based on a lack of informed consent. The province announced on Wednesday that beginning November 8th, even more Albertans are eligible for a third dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. That includes Albertans 70 or older, First Nations, Métis and Inuit 18 years of age and older, frontline healthcare workers who received their first two doses less than 8 weeks apart, and Albertans who received 2 doses of AstraZeneca or 1 dose of Janssen while abroad. Indigenous communities and frontline healthcare workers must also have received their second dose more than 6 months ago to be eligible. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says the measures his government has taken has helped to lower COVID-19 cases in our province. There are currently 691 Albertans in hospital with the virus, along with 159 in intensive care.
What we have in fact have seen is that the measured and balanced approach taken by this government and Albertans rising to the challenge, increasing their vaccination rates and observing reasonable public health measures have resulted in a massive decline in COVID infections, hospitalizations in this province. But we know what the NDP's answer is always to this: hard and endless lockdowns.
Fortunately, more than 314,000 Albertans have also recovered from COVID-19. Premier Kenney, like many other provincial leaders, has been grilled over his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson says it appears as though Kenney is not accepting all of the blame, but placed some of it at the feet of our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw.
Kenny was being asked, who was in charge when you were on vacation in August? Why didn't you do anything as cases were beginning to climb towards the end of August? And the Premier's response was basically, Dr. Dina Hinshaw didn't make any particular recommendations at that time, so we didn't do anything. Kenny has said at other points in the pandemic that, sort of the buck stops with him. Decisions are made by politicians, not public health officials. So there was, some are seeing sort of a contradiction inherent there and believing that he's sort of casting blame on Dina Hinshaw.
Tyler Dawson will also discuss how anti-mask protesters left behind some scary objects at a UCP MLA's home. That's coming up later in our program. Lethbridge East MLA Nathan Neudorf says receiving the COVID-19 vaccine should always be a personal choice. During question period at the legislature today, Neudorf said that is why veterans fought so hard for our freedoms and why last April the UCP introduced Bill 66, which removed from the Health Act the ability for the government to mandate vaccinations.
We should not now allow other entities to infringe on these sacred freedoms that the democratically elected government of Alberta has removed from its own legislative abilities. Mr. Speaker, I believe the government should be limited in scope to serve and protect the citizens of its jurisdiction. We must recognize the true significance of the price paid to secure these freedoms and protect them at all costs.
A Lethbridge native has authored a new book based on what he says is one of the worst movies ever made. As Micah Quinn explains now, the movie, starring former Hollywood legend John Wayne, generated a huge amount of controversy and allegedly resulted in the subsequent deaths years later of a large majority of the cast and crew.
Ryan Udawilligan says his book entitled Killing John Wayne, The Making of the Conqueror, highlights ups and downs of the 1956 movie, The Conqueror. Filming took place near nuclear testing sites in Nevada that were only 153 miles away from the film set in St. George, Utah. The ensuing radiation reportedly caused more than 90 out of the 220 members of the cast and crew to develop some form of cancer and die later on. The book dives headfirst into these stories from the making of the movie.
The book gets into the history of nuclear testing, why it started there, sort of the behind-the-scenes fascination with what nuclear testing was viewed as during that time. And in the 40s and 50s, it was new and exciting and kind of marketable. People were visiting Las Vegas so they could stay in a hotel and feel the rumble of the nuclear bombs that were being detonated nearby.
Udawilligan says the producer of the movie, Howard Hughes, called up the Atomic Energy Commission and asked if it would be safe to film the movie near the nuclear testing sites. The commission gave him a resounding yes to the question.
And the crew was sort of, I don't know about this. And it was John Wayne who just said to everyone it would be un-American if we left right now. And so he was the one who led the charge. There's a famous picture of him with a Geiger counter, which, he's counting the radiation in the area, and he just wanted to prove to everyone there was no negative radiation in the area. And the Geiger counter apparently just went berserk, like off the charts, and he's like, this thing must be broken. And evidently it was not.
You can buy the book Killing John Wayne, The Making of the Conqueror on Amazon or by shopping at Analog Books in Lethbridge. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Wow, an incredible story. Every year Lethbridge residents throw out the equivalent of 65 t-shirts per person in the landfill. That includes over 1,000 tons of textile waste, including clothing, linens, and even stuffed toys end up in the garbage. Now that's according to Environment Lethbridge. Kathleen Shepard, the executive director of the organization, says a website has been created to help us curb our waste.
So one of the things we're really encouraging, especially as we head into the Christmas season, is for people to find ways to reduce their textile footprint. And there's a number of things you can do. One is asking that question before you buy that new shirt or new pair of pants as to whether you really need it. But part of it too goes to making sure that your clothes and other textiles last as long as possible. So making sure that you're caring for them properly, and also buying items as the best quality that you can to help extend their lifespan.
Environment Lethbridge was established in 2012 and aims to educate viewers about the importance of sustainability. Well, we had some winter driving conditions this past weekend, but this weekend we could see double-digit temperatures. What does that mean when it comes to winterizing your vehicle? Should we be putting on our snow tires right now? BCN's Naveen Day spoke with a local tire shop to get some insight.
Many of us who swapped our summer tires for winter ones last weekend are thankful that we did so. However, winter tires are not recommended if the temperatures get too warm, like the weather forecast predicts for this weekend. Is it too early to swap our tires? The manager at Cal Tire North here in Lethbridge says no.
The minimal amount of time that we'll be driving these higher temperature is minimal. It's temporary, and you'll have a lot more peace of mind once you have those tires installed and you're ready for the snowfall when it comes. Typically around October, November, when the temperature starts consistently being below 7 degrees, some rubber compounds stop their proper traction and need to have winter tires installed.
And once the windy conditions give the city an icy kiss, it will be easy to spot those who use their all-season tires year-round. If you are one of those people and are looking to get a set of winter tires, Lefley gives some pointers of what to look for.
All season is what we call a 3-season tire. It's good for late spring, summer, and early fall. It's rated M+S, which is mud and snow, which is 3 millimeters of snow. Winter rated has the Three Peak Mountain snowflake rating on it, which means it is a winter rated tire, legal to go into BC, for example. We have all weather tires and winters that have that rating on them.
Leffley says his shop is not currently overwhelmed with tire swaps and installations. His business is currently booking appointments as early as 2 days out. For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day.
And you know, a lot of that snow we saw the last few days in Lethbridge has since melted. Jeanette Rocher is here now with a sneak peek at the weather forecast. Jeanette, are we seeing some warmer temperatures? In fact, even warmer than the average high for this time of year?
Yeah, well, that's true, Hal. The average temperature for this time of year is actually just under 8 degrees. And today we saw temperatures up in the double digits. We got to about a high of 12, 13 today. Although with the wind, it doesn't quite feel like it. You still have to wear a jacket to feel comfortable. But those double-digit temperatures will be sticking around for the next few days until we hit more seasonal and below seasonal averages next week. I'll have more details for you later on in the show.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. An Alberta man charged with the first-degree murder of a family doctor at a medical clinic in Red Deer has died. Deng Mabior was to stand trial on November 22nd in the death of Dr. Walter Reynolds. Reynolds, a 45-year-old father of two, was killed at the Village Mall walk-in clinic on August 10th of last year. Lawyer Jason Snyder, who was appointed as a friend of the court to help Mabior, who intended to represent himself, says he died at Calgary's Foothills Hospital. There were reports that Mabior was battling cancer. A group that represents 16 First Nations in central Alberta says it does not support the idea of the province replacing the RCMP with a provincial police force. The Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations says proper consultations have not been done with its members about the proposal. Last week, the province released the study, which found switching to a provincial police force service would be too costly, but could be more effective over time. Grand Chief Greg Desjarlais says if there is going to be a different police force, the Confederacy would like its own fully equipped force that would work with First Nations within Treaty 6 territory. The BC government announced the province intends to work in partnership with First Nations to defer harvest of up to 2.6 million hectares of the province's most at-risk ancient old-growth forests.
In line with the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review, we are taking action to sustain our forests for future generations. With the support of the independent scientific panel, we've identified 2.6 million hectares of our largest, rarest, and most ancient old-growth forests. Our government is prepared to defer harvest within these 2.6 million hectares of old growth, pending consultation with First Nations rights and title holders. To be clear, deferring harvest in an area this large is unprecedented and surpasses the size of 226 cities of Vancouver, or over 6,400 Stanley Parks.
Meanwhile, in Saskatchewan, the Regina Police Service says a 16-year-old girl is the city's 12th homicide of the year. The girl's body was found outside of a home after officers were called for a weapons offense early Monday morning. Officers also found an injured male who was taken to the hospital for treatment. Police say they are not identified or arrested any of the suspects. Manitoba's new premier says her government will do everything it can to help keep businesses open in an area of the province with a low COVID-19 vaccination rate. Southern Health has COVID-19 case counts approaching levels seen during the second wave when the region was moved to critical on the pandemic response system. Premier Heather Stephenson says she plans to meet with the province's chief public health officer, but does not want to order a lockdown on businesses. The Southern Health region accounts for about half of the COVID-19 patients in intensive care and 28% of the province's active cases.
While we're finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, the COVID-19 pandemic has created and exposed new challenges in our healthcare system and our economy. The redirecting of healthcare resources to respond to COVID-19 created significant surgical and diagnostic backlogs that are hurting the health of our seniors and vulnerable Manitobans. The significant challenge we faced in our personal care homes exposed flaws in our long-term care system, showing that our seniors are not always receiving the respectful and dignified care that they deserve. And our overwhelmed intensive care units demonstrated that we need a system that can better adapt to the public health crisis. Our government will take immediate action to address these challenges. In the coming weeks, we will establish a task force to clear the surgical and diagnostic backlogs and enhance our ICU capacity.
Meanwhile, in Ontario, they plan to offer booster doses of COVID-19 vaccines to all residents, with the next priority group able to book appointments starting on Saturday. There are 2.75 million people who became eligible for boosters starting November the 6th.
In response to the latest evidence and guidance from the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, I am pleased to announce that the province will begin to offer booster doses of the COVID-19 vaccine to additional populations if at least 6 months have passed since their second dose. These groups include those aged 70 and over, healthcare workers and designated essential caregivers in congregate settings, individuals who received 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine or 1 dose of the Janssen vaccine, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis adults and their non-Indigenous household members. These additional groups will benefit from a booster dose as they are at increased risk of waning immunity and greater risk of exposure, serious illness, and outcomes.
The United States entered a new phase in its COVID-19 vaccination campaign, with shots now available to millions of elementary-age children.
The CDC director finally gave approval to authorize COVID vaccine to be given to children from ages 5 to 11. So today is the first day we've been giving this vaccine, and our phones are ringing off the hook.
I think, I felt certainly relieved when I was vaccinated, but I feel like I have more control over my exposures, at least, currently, and especially when she went back to school, and even though school is being careful, she's out of my sphere, my protective bubble, and I wanted another bubble over her.
A Catholic nun who opposes the death penalty signed her name to a brief submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court. Sister Barbara Batista says the document argues against a Texas policy restricting spiritual comfort at executions.
I hope that if the state still is going to execute Mr. Ramirez, that at the very least, that he be allowed, his clergy person in the room, in the death chamber, he be allowed to pray out loud with him, and that clergy person be allowed to actually physically touch Mr. Ramirez to give him some human contact before he takes his last breath.
Voters in Seattle, Washington are choosing a new mayor, and policing is a major issue in the race. There are still calls within the city to defund the police department.
I'm also concerned about policing in Seattle and the national outrage last year and what's happening in our city in terms of keeping those who don't have access to safe spaces, who are marginalized and oppressed, and how we police them unjustly in a city that considers itself so progressive.
I think defunding the police is the most ignorant thing we could do as a society. I mean, our police are what keep us safe. They're out there every day working hard for us, keeping us safe, protecting them, and then we want to defund them. And then where does that leave us now with the problem we got? Look at the crime rates in Seattle right now.
It was on this day that the Iran-Contra scandal began to unfold. Chile's Salvador Allende took office, and former pro wrestler Jesse Ventura was elected Minnesota governor. This is Today in History for November the 3rd.
November 3rd, 1986. The Iran-Contra affair begins to unfold as a Lebanese magazine breaks the story of secret U.S. arms sales to Tehran. President Ronald Reagan initially denies trading arms to secure the release of American hostages in Lebanon.
In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
Also, part of the money from the arms sales was diverted to the Contras, the American-backed rebels in Nicaragua. Both revelations, which involve violations of official U.S. policy, engulf the Reagan administration in scandal. 1970. In Chile, Salvador Allende takes office as the first socialist president of that South American country. Allende, who faces U.S. opposition while in power, dies when a military coup overthrows him a few years later. 1992. In Illinois, Carol Moseley Braun becomes the first black woman elected to the U.S. Senate. and 1998. A political body slam in Minnesota.
We've shocked the world. Minnesota leads the way.
Where former pro wrestler Jesse Ventura wins the governor's race in an upset. Today in history, November 3rd. Carlotta Bradley, The Associated Press.
Elijah Stacey is someone who was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy at a very young age. It's a fatal muscle wasting disease. Elijah wrote a book about his journey called A Small If. He says during his trials, he met with his doctor who insisted that a rod be installed in his back to deal with a curved spine, but Elijah simply refused.
I'm not accepting this news. I do not want a metal rod on my back, and I'm saying I'm not going to have the surgery. So I asked him, hey, can I just not have the surgery? He said, you could, but as your doctor, I got to really point to you having the surgery. You know, I got to put my foot down. You got to have the surgery. So the time goes on again. Then I asked him again. I said, so if I was able to reverse the current state of my spine, could I then avoid having to get the surgery? And he said, well, I don't want to give you any false hope. I've never seen this being done before. It's basically medically impossible. But because I know you, I will give you a small if.
Catch the very powerful interview with Elijah Stacey and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up in the second half of our program. Well, it was good to see a lot of the snow melt here in the city, and the warmer temperatures should be continuing for the rest of the week. Complete weather details are coming up. The meltdown continues across much of southwestern Alberta. A lot of the snow we saw over the weekend is now gone. Jeanette Rocher is back with a complete look at the weather forecast. Jeanette, those milder double-digit temperatures should be sticking around for quite some time.
Yeah, they will be, Hal. Actually, this time of year, we are seeing an average high of about 8 degrees, but we have been quite a bit higher than that lately. Although with all the wind, it feels a little chillier, as I was saying earlier. Into tomorrow, we are seeing a high of 14 degrees. With that wind, we're going to be sticking around a 50-kilometer-per-hour wind gust. Into Friday, looking at a high of 13 degrees with a mix of sun and cloud. 11 for Saturday before dropping into those single digits again on Sunday with a high of 8 degrees. Monday, we're looking at 6 degrees and 7 for Tuesday. So we are seeing these lovely above higher than average temperatures before dropping back to seasonal average and even below that. So as I said before, average high for this time of year, 8 degrees, average low -4. 22 is where we were at back in 1962. That was the warmest on this day. And the chilliest was -16 back in 1991. Sun rose this morning at 8:24 a.m. and our sunset this evening right at 6:06 p.m., giving us 9 hours and 41 minutes of daylight. So we're just under that 10-hour mark now as days are getting shorter. High of 13 tomorrow in Victoria. Rain on the west coast tomorrow. So looking also at 60 to 70 kilometer-per-hour wind gusts in Victoria, 60K wind gusts near the water in Vancouver, looking at 10 to 50 millimeters of rain there. Edmonton's high 11 degrees. Could be seeing some wind chill tomorrow morning at Edmonton too, feeling like -5, seeing a high of 13 tomorrow in Calgary as well. 10 degrees the high tomorrow in Saskatoon with a mix of sun and cloud. 11 the high in Regina, sunny skies there. And sunshine also expected tomorrow in Winnipeg with a high of 9 degrees. As we look to the central part of the country, we're seeing chance of rain in Toronto, high of 4 degrees in Ottawa. Feeling some wind chill there tomorrow in the morning as well. Going to feel like -10, but get up to 4 tomorrow. 5 degrees is the high tomorrow in Montreal with lots of sunshine as well. As we look to the East Coast, we're seeing sunny skies in Fredericton with a high of 6, sunshine in Halifax with a high of 10, high of 8 in Charlottetown. Expecting some rain there, also expecting some showers in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is right here behind me. High of 10 degrees and some 70 kilometer-per-hour wind gusts. So there you have it. That is your weather forecast.
Edmonton-based budget carrier Flair Airlines is welcoming Ottawa's decision to allow international air traffic to return to 8 more airports at the end of the month. The airline says it's eager to offer flights to those wanting to enjoy some sun this fall and winter. Airports in Regina and Saskatoon will join 10 others already handling international flights, including Calgary, Edmonton, and Winnipeg. Transport Canada says it's able to ease a ban imposed in February thanks to higher COVID-19 vaccination levels and strict vaccine travel requirements that will be fully phased in by November the 30th. There's been a huge turnaround at Cenovus Energy. The company reported a profit of $551 million. That compares with a loss of $194 million a year ago. Revenue soared to $12.7 billion. That is up from nearly $3.7 billion in the same quarter last year. The increase came as total upstream production rose more than 70% from a year ago to almost 805,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. The Calgary-based company says it is doubling its quarterly dividend to 3.5 cents per share and announced a buyback plan for up to 10% of its shares. DesRosiers Automotive Consultant says Canadian auto sales last month fell to their lowest level in a decade. The consultancy estimates light vehicle sales totaled 128,419 for the month. That was down almost 18% from a year earlier, following a decline of close to 20% in September. DesRosiers says vehicle shortages caused by semiconductor supply chain issues continue to weigh heavily on the industry. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 95 points on the day to 21,170. The Dow was up 104 points to 36,157. The S&P 500 was up 29 points to 4660, and the Nasdaq was also up on the day 161 points to 15,811. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down $3.86 to $80.05 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 32 cents to $5.86 US. Gold was down $17.96 to $17.69.80 US an ounce, and silver was even on the day at $23.52 US an ounce. Wheat is at $11.84 per bushel, barley's at $9.47, canola's at $22.68, and corn is at $10.21 per bushel. Live cattle were up $1.70 to $131.65, feeder cattle were up $1.60 to $159, and lean hogs were up $1.70 to $75.95. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 80.71 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, a Calgary pastor and his brother are appealing stiff fines and other sanctions imposed after they were convicted of contempt for violating our province's COVID-19 health rules. Pastor Arthur Pulowski and his brother David say sanctions imposed last month were a violation of their charter rights. The pair were fined a total of $53,000. When it comes to our province's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney allegedly laid some of the blame with our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have details for us shortly. Premier Jason Kenney is not happy that Alberta was not consulted about how Ottawa will put a hard cap on oil and gas emissions, especially considering how the energy sector is a major part of our economy here. To discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, the Prime Minister made the announcement about the hard cap in Glasgow, Scotland recently, and apparently government officials here tried to speak with the feds about a cap before, but didn't receive a response?
So Alberta does sort of have a cap at the moment that was actually negotiated in the Rachel Notley years of about 100 megatons per year. But Prime Minister Trudeau, speaking in Glasgow, has announced, this hard cap, saying this is, a big step for an oil-producing country to take. Now, a bit of a strange thing where the province, as you mentioned, has said that they tried to reach out to the federal government to discuss this. And never really received a response. And also the government saying that they haven't actually decided what this cap is going to be. All which is to say, the Premier not happy, clearly saying that, a heads up, I guess, would have been nice because it is a big part of our economy. But it's a little bit unclear, going forward what the effect is going to be when something like this might come into place. But clearly more not great news, shall we say, for the oil and gas sector in this province.
Tyler, the UCP is reviewing its HR policies following a sexual harassment scandal, which apparently hit Premier Kenney's party. Now, a former staffer sued the Premier's office, saying she was wrongfully terminated and that the reason she was fired was because she was complaining about a toxic work environment and she allegedly witnessed some sexual harassment in the workplace?
Yeah, so this came sort of right as the legislature returned, when clearly Jason Kenney and his party were looking to get moving on their agenda, so to speak, and then this lawsuit hit the Premier's office. So the sort of short version of it is that this staffer was let go and sued for wrongful termination, and basically said that she had seen sexual harassment at the legislature and that there was a toxic work environment with heavy drinking and things like that. And so she believed that she had been speaking out about that, and that's why she was fired. So this obviously kicked off something of a firestorm down at the legislature. Leela here, a UCP MLA, formerly in cabinet actually, but kicked out after the sort of Sky Palace drama of earlier this year, basically called on Jason Kenney to resign. He received considerable criticism. from the New Democrats. And yes, they have brought in an outside source, I guess, to review the HR policies, but certainly not the sort of thing that the UCP would have wanted to be making the headlines on the first week back for the legislature.
The UCP says a provincial police force and not the RCMP would be better suited to handle Alberta's needs. But Tyler, if the province moves ahead with such an initiative, it could become quite costly.
So viewers will perhaps remember that this has been a part of this discussion of more Alberta autonomy for quite some time. This was raised in the 2001 firewall letter, and the Fair Deal panel brought it back up. So this is basically an outside study looking at how such a transition might happen. And basically they come back and say, look, there are problems with the RCMP in terms of response times in rural areas. Some residents don't feel that the RCMP is responsive to their needs. There's obviously a different legacy among Indigenous people in the province who have concerns with the RCMP. And so this is basically an opportunity for the government to build a new police force, one that is responsive to the needs and concerns of Albertans. But as you say, cost is a factor. As it stands at the moment, Alberta, the provincial government and municipalities spend about $600 million a year on RCMP contract policing. And then another $170 million comes from the federal government for a total of, the seven, whatever that would be, 770, I guess. And the switch to a provincial police force would cost about $750 million. They give a bit of a range, but that's sort of the middle ground. The catch here, of course, is that Alberta would have to pay all of that. There would be no federal subsidy for it. And there would also be $360-ish million in transition costs over sort of a 6-year period from beginning to end. So, Casey Madhu, the Justice Minister, did say, at a certain point, we have to think about what's good for Alberta and not just cost. But that sort of top line figure is something that is, I think, if they continue to go forward with this, is something that's going to be on people's minds, and they're going to have to watch spending quite closely on it, I think.
Absolutely. Now, Tyler, Grand Prairie MLA Tracy Allard says anti-mask protesters, around 30 of them, came to her home and apparently left a noose and a small wooden gallows, or some of the gallows behind. And one of the gallows had a message that said, "No to masks and the government, and hang them all." Now, she called it a clear act of aggression. Now, what's notable is that Allard has been quite vocal against COVID-19 restrictions.
Yeah, so Tracy Allard's the MLA up in Grand Prairie, which has, generally been a less, say, happy to see restrictions part of the province. And Tracy Allard was a signatory on that letter back in April, I think it was, that there was a number of UCP MLAs who basically called on the government to not institute more public health restrictions, sort of in the third wave. Big controversy at the time, but yeah, so it is interesting, of course, that Tracy Allard would be a target of this group of people, and obviously the sort of anti-mask protests they've not burned out. Of course, we saw back in the spring huge protests about this. Private security had to be hired to protect Dr. Dina Hinshaw, and of course, this latest, as Allard said, act of aggression led to condemnation from Rachel Notley, the NDP leader, and Casey Madhu, the Justice Minister, both saying that Alberta, there's no place for this stuff in Alberta. But it does tend to highlight, I think, that the tensions and tempers perhaps are still very high on these issues.
Yeah, absolutely, especially during the pandemic. A lot of the lockdowns, restrictions, people are feeling quite anxious, depressed, and sometimes certain groups are lashing out. We're seeing that all over the province, especially with some of the rallies too. Now, Tyler, let's talk about the equalization referendum which passed. Around 62% of Albertans voting in favor of reforming equalization to give Albertans more of a fair deal, as Premier Kenney calls it. So, Tyler, let me ask you something. What's next?
Well, so the first next step is a motion in the legislature that has been introduced that will sort of ratify the results of the referendum. The question, of course, is whether or not it will proceed as trying to get a constitutional amendment, or if the province is going to try and use this in some way to get leverage on other policies it doesn't like. Now, the crucial thing here is that basically everybody thinks that equalization needs to be reformed. You won't find that many people who think it needs to be eliminated, but it does need to be reformed. The last change to equalization came in 2008, 2009 during the financial crisis when Stephen Harper was prime minister. And of course, the world is very different now than it was in 2009. The issues facing Canada are very different than the ones during the financial crisis. So there's this referendum on one hand, there's this program that probably needs reform on the other hand, and you have sort of Jason Kenney and Justin Trudeau in the middle, sort of brandishing their fists at one another over the referendum. So I think the open question actually is whether or not the Liberals are going to be responsive to this, regardless of the referendum, or if they're going to, kick the can down the road. So it is, to be blunt, possible that nothing happens, Hal. But certainly the provincial government is hoping that there's going to be some sort of negotiation or discussion about some of these reforms, whether that's, resource revenue reforms or Alberta getting more money back through some sort of other fiscal stabilization. But it frankly remains to be seen a little bit.
It's funny, I chat with Brian Lilly. He's one of our regular contributors as well on our show, Political Report in Toronto. And I asked him, because he's following Trudeau all of the time, he's following Erin O'Toole, and I asked him specifically, what do you think will happen, the result of this referendum here in Alberta when it comes to equalization? He says, probably not much at all. Trudeau will look at it and say, well, that's nice. Tyler, Premier Jason Kenney, like many of our country's premiers, has been grilled in the legislature about his government's handling of the pandemic. But you know what? Our Premier even apparently laid some of the blame on our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Hinshaw.
That is certainly how people have been talking about this. So, as you say, he's been grilled over the pandemic response. The New Democrats and some of the independent MLAs, Drew Barnes among them, have been calling for sort of an all-party committee that might look into the UCP's handling of the pandemic. So it's very much a live issue in the legislature right now. And this was on Monday, I think, when Kenney was being asked, who was in charge when you were on vacation in August? Why didn't you do anything as cases were beginning to climb towards the end of August? And the Premier's response was basically, Dr. Deena Hinshaw didn't make any particular recommendations at that time, so we didn't do anything. Kenney has said at other points in the pandemic that, sort of the buck stops with him. Decisions are made by politicians, not public health officials. So there was, some are seeing sort of a contradiction inherent there and believing that he's sort of casting blame on Deena Hinshaw. And of course, it's worth probably pointing out at this point that, we don't actually know what the advice is that Deena Hinshaw is giving the Premier at any sort of given moment. This advice is not public. She has been fairly loath to discuss the options that are before her and before the Premier on this front. So there's a little bit of an information deficit there, I guess, is what I'm saying. And certainly this is not an issue that I see going away anytime soon in the legislature.
Tyler, the province has introduced legislation to make it easier for out-of-province professionals to get accredited here. Now, the government said it would remove red tape and improve labor mobility. Tell me more.
So this is part of the government's sort of overall red tape reduction strategy, and it's also part of the sort of broader, conservative strategy among premiers and to improve the sort of interprovincial trade and mobility issues. So what this would do basically is some of these professional bodies, say for a lawyer, for example, or an accountant or something like that, they'd have to set timelines for adjudicating these decisions, and they'd have to set up an appeals process. So, if someone got rejected, they would have a way to appeal this. And the Premier has been fairly enthusiastic about this as a way to get more people coming to Alberta, more professionals coming to Alberta. Doesn't strike me as an especially controversial piece of legislation, frankly. But we certainly will have to see whether or not that does lead to an influx of people from other provinces. But it's an interesting piece of legislation, and one I think that I'll be keeping an eye on closely.
Well, it's the Alberta advantage too. We only have GST here, no HSTs, so maybe that'll be another attractive thing to bring people, more people to our province. Tyler, the UCP introduced a bill to try and manage the trails on public lands outside of provincial parks. Now, what kind of power would the Trails Act give Environment and Parks Minister Jason Nixon?
Well, it would basically allow Jason Nixon to sort of designate trails. There's like 13,000 trails or something like that on these public use land zone areas. And of course, this would be the sort of the Castle area and the Nordegg area. And a couple others that are very popular. So this would basically allow the minister to say, for example, this trail is not allowed to be used for off-highway vehicles or something like that. It would, in case of there were, environmental concerns or ecosystem concerns. And it would also allow the government to sort of create these deals with recreation groups for some of the trail maintenance. You already see a lot of that, but it seems like it would sort of formalize that process a little bit. Now, again, not a super controversial piece of legislation, although the NDP has raised concerns about this sort of unilateral power of the minister, which I suppose one could raise objections to. But certainly interesting to see them going ahead on some of this other parks, or not parks, but sort of wildland area stuff that they have done over the last couple of years as well. It's clearly still a priority for this government.
Now, speaking of the parks, and let's talk about our natural habitat and environment here. What about more talk of coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies? Paul Brandt, Corb Lund, a lot of country singers have been outspoken about it. A lot of people here are quite concerned because they're saying the selenium from the coal mine will make its way into the Oldman River, affecting our water supply, impacting our livestock as well. So is this still a big topic of discussion at the legislature, the coal mining?
It doesn't seem to have come up as a big issue yet. I think it probably will. And the reason I say that is because the NDP made a lot of hay with it during the last sitting of the legislature. And, it's a valuable political issue for them because they're also, sort of on the side of a lot of conservative Albertans who might otherwise be UCP voters. It's been very polarizing. And I believe the UCP government has said they're going to be studying and consulting on this more. But it's very hard to imagine there being considerable coal mine development, at this point, considering the opposition, considering the popularity of some of the people who are behind this opposition. But I have no doubt that we are going to hear about it. Unless I missed it, which is possible, I have not heard a whole lot of rumblings about it in the past week and a half or so.
Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
How would you respond if you were diagnosed with a fatal disease? Well, naturally speaking, I think a lot of us would feel despair and sink into depression. Or would it be possible to rise up in faith and fight to overcome? Well, today's guest is only 20 years of age. Elijah Stacey was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's a fatal muscle wasting disease. He's also written a book called A Small If. Welcome to Bridge City News, Elijah. We're so happy to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Absolutely. Now, Elijah, can you first of all tell us what Duchenne's disease is? When were you diagnosed? How old were you? And how has it affected you?
Yeah, so Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it's a muscle wasting disease that eats away a person's muscles as time goes on. So we started noticing signs when I was about 5 years old. I wouldn't be able to keep up with my peers on the playground. I walked on my tippy toes. Going upstairs was a challenge. These things that were very abnormal for my age. So then I was officially diagnosed with the disease when I was 6 years old. And as time went on, I became completely dependent on a wheelchair when I was 11 years old because I became too weak to bear any weight on my legs. And then later in your teenage years, you start to lose mobility in your arms. So you can't lift your arms above your head or anything like that. It's very challenging there. And the worst part about the disease is it's a fatal disease, as you said, and that's because it attacks the heart and diaphragm because those are muscles too, and Duchenne is a muscle wasting disease.
My gosh, that is absolutely devastating, and this has hit your family hard as well, obviously. So 2 of your brothers were also diagnosed with Duchenne's disease. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, that's correct. So my youngest brother, Kai, he's 14 years old. He's in 8th grade. He also has Duchenne, and he's in a power wheelchair as well. And then my other brother, Max, he's 14, but he passed away. So he's in heaven now. But he had Duchenne as well. But he also had other health complications. When he was born, he had a massive stroke that led to him being cognitively delayed, blind, unable to speak, needing a feeding tube, and confined to a bed with a full-time nurse, and my mom taking care of him, basically full-time as well. So that was my brother Max.
Oh my gosh, that is so sad. I'm so sorry to hear that. Is this disease hereditary?
So the way it works is that it will be like my mom doesn't have the disease, so it is genetic, but it's not hereditary, and so it's X-linked. So the mother will pass it down. It's on the X chromosome, and so it comes from her because during reproduction, the mother will have 2 X chromosomes to put up, and my older brother, he's actually completely healthy and fine. He got the good one, and then the rest of us, we got the bad one. So, but there's a reason, I believe, why we have the disease that we have.
Yeah, and you're so positive, Elijah. You're quite the go-getter too. And I understand that you started up a nonprofit organization at the age of 15 called Destroy Duchenne. How's that going? What are your goals with this?
Yeah, so Destroy Duchenne, I started when I was 15, and it's a nonprofit that aims at advancing a medical science to cure this disease. So we're trying to raise tons of money to help science and to help minimize the suffering that people face, and that's really our main focus. And so, very, very passionate about that. Very passionate about business and all those good things. So I have a lot of fun doing that because my overall life cause is to minimize human suffering and propel human prosperity so that humanity can have a better quality of life. So there's all different ways I'm trying to do that, and the nonprofit is one of those.
Wow. And now, at the age of 16, you chose physical therapy over surgery. So, why did you make that decision?
Yeah, so I went to my doctor, and my spine was starting to curve more and more, and he started to advocate that, you need to have a metal rod inserted into your back. And I didn't want a metal rod inserted into my back. And so that was just terrible news. So I'm going back and forth with my doctor. I look over to my left, my mom's crying. My dad has his head down. That's what he does when he's sitting there smiling because I'm not accepting this news. I do not want a metal rod in my back, and I'm saying I'm not going to have the surgery. So I asked him, hey, can I just not have the surgery? He said, you could, but as your doctor, I got to really point to you having the surgery. I got to put my foot down. You got to have the surgery. So the time goes on again. And then I asked him again, I said, so if I was able to reverse the current state of my spine, could I then avoid having to get the surgery? And he said, well, I don't want to give you any false hope. I've never seen this being done before. It's basically medically impossible. But because I know you, I will give you a small if. And so from that day forward, I went to physical therapy, did intense stretching and all kinds of things like that. Worked out all day. I hung a picture up of my x-ray so I can get in the right mindset every day. I even taught myself how to cook in a wheelchair. So I'm driving the wheelchair with one hand, holding a pan in the other hand, going to the stove, right? I'm doing all of that. And 3 months later, I go to the doctors and my spine is straighter. I don't have to get the surgery. All it took was a small if. It took that possibility, that small chance, and I worked with it and made it happen.
Oh, wow. And of course, A Small If is the title of the book that you wrote.
Yep. And really, my whole life, as I wrote the book, I could see a small if, throughout my whole life. These things that I'm not supposed to do with small possibilities and then go and make it happen.
Oh, gosh, that is absolutely amazing. Now, in your book, you write about something that you call an adapter's mindset. So can you maybe explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the adapter's mindset, it's one of the lessons in my book. There's a lesson at the end of the first 13 chapters, but this lesson, the adapter's mindset, is all about being in the mindset that no matter what comes your way, you're going to adapt to it. Right. And so being in a wheelchair, I had to adapt to get in and out of my bed by myself, went to the bathroom by myself, getting in the shower by myself. Right. You have to adapt to it because it's going to be a lot harder than just to stand up and do it. Right. And sometimes the way you have to adapt, though, was swallowing your pride and asking for help. That's a key way to adapt. But the whole mindset, the adapter's mindset is to be open to being creative and to being open to however I got to make this happen, I got to make it happen. That's the adapter's mindset. It's just I take no for an answer and just find a way to make it happen.
Gosh, that is amazing. What a strong individual you are, seriously. So what's the difference between controlling something and influencing it? And which one is better in your opinion?
Well, yeah. So I don't think there's necessarily a better one. I just think the benefit of this is to recognize the difference because it frees you from stress and emotional bondage to things. So controlling something is to be able to determine the actual outcome of it, right? You can absolutely control the outcome of it. Where influencing something is you can affect something, but you can't necessarily control the outcome. And what I would say is that you got to focus on what you can control and disregard what you cannot. And a majority of things are not in your control. And so when you realize that, it really frees you from a lot of the stress and stuff. So, for example, the example I like to give people is, let's say I want to make somebody like me. So I'll be very nice to them, polite, take an interest in them. But at the end of the day, that's not in my control. They may not like anybody, so they may just, not like me as well, right? And that's not in my control. But all I can do is try and influence them to like me and be a good person, be nice to them, right? And so that's the difference between the two. And I think when you really realize that, it really helps you in your life, having this disease and the challenges that come with it, knowing what I can influence and knowing what I can control is very important to keep myself in a healthy state of mind.
Yeah, totally. Now, in your book, you talk about using negative energy as a motivation, which I think is really cool because you've experienced some bullying and you've also experienced people not believing that you'd be able to, heal yourself or get the the spine, I guess, straight. Or maybe talk a little bit about that, using that negative energy as motivation. How does that work?
Yeah, so I call it rocket fuel. I call it rocket fuel in my book. And basically, it's when somebody doubts you, right? They believe that you can't do this or that. That's free motivation to go prove to yourself that no, I'm right about myself. You say I can't do this. I believe I can do it. I'm going to prove myself to be right, and I'm going to prove you to be wrong. And that's what that's all about. So it's free motivation. And the way I like to think about it, it's like, it's a classic example of like using evil for good. We read it in the Bible that God is constantly taking evil and then using it and turning it into good for his purposes. And so it's that similar thing. And that's really what I've been trying to do my whole life. I turned my wheelchair into my advantage. I turned this power chair into a power chair, right? That's what I like to say. And so, you have to use you got to turn your disadvantages into your advantages. And so people being, putting their insecurities on you and doubting you and trying to tear you down, that's just free motivation. That's using negative energy for a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I mean, you brought up your faith. So as a person of faith, how do you reconcile your suffering or your disease with your beliefs?
Well, so like I said, I believe that God gave me this disease for a reason. I think that there's a reason that he wants me to have this disease. And what I realize is that, being in a wheelchair, it draws more attention to myself. Let's keep it honest. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. If I'm living my life as Christ and I'm being a Christ-like example to people, and I can go and tell people about them, they're going to remember me more than if I didn't have the wheelchair. The wheelchair is just more memorable. It's different. And so that's a really powerful message there. But not just that, the credibility behind it. The Bible deals a lot with suffering. Jesus spent a lot of time healing people that had, some type of illness or whatever. But not just that, but people with suffering. He consulted with them. And I think that, having the suffering that I have, it makes me very credible to say that the Bible is the solution to people's problems. It will lead to the fulfillment and joy that you are seeking. The things of the world will not do that. You seek after money, you seek after fame, you seek after these things of the world, but you still feel empty. You're still searching. But when you have God, he fills that emptiness inside of you. It's a supernatural thing. That's what I believe, at least. And I just think that the wheelchair and the suffering that I go through it allows me to communicate that effectively to people that may not know it.
That's amazing. Now, in your book, you have many lessons, and one of them that you teach about is self-image, and I'm sure that you've gone through that yourself. So why is self-image so key, and how can a person build up their own self-image?
Yeah, so the self-image is, how do you view yourself, right? And how you view yourself is going to relate to how you act. And how you act is how other people are going to see you. So it's very important that, okay, well, how do you see yourself? So if you see yourself as timid and shy and maybe not so confident, you're probably going to act that way. But if you see yourself as a confident individual, you're probably going to act confident. And thus people are going to think you're confident. And that's going to be just a loop of positivity and reinforcing that self-image. So if somebody wants to change their self-image, they have to think about it. Well, what image do you want? What do you want to be? You want to be a confident person? Well, think about times in your past as proof of when you were confident. Maybe you raised your hand in class and nobody else did. That may be small, but that's all you need to get going. So then you say, okay, no, I do have some confidence in me. And then you can visualize and really think about it mentally and just kind of go through it. Visualize yourself thinking about being confident and imagine yourself in a certain situation. Maybe you're talking on stage, or maybe you're going to go approach somebody that you normally wouldn't approach, right? That right there is how you're going to build that self-image. And then as you practice it, you're going to become more and more aligned with that new self-image that you want.
That's amazing. So many good nuggets in this book, but you also write about the need to be self-sacrificing. So what's that all about?
Yeah, so that lesson highly influenced by my faith, right? That just to start off, the Son of God came down to sacrifice his life for us so that we could be saved, right? So that right there tells you something, that sacrifice is important. But I think that the world today is too selfish. I think people are way too selfish within their friendships, romantic relationships, and just the way that we deal with people within our communities. I think that we need to self-sacrifice from time to time. And I think that would make things a lot better. If I, for example, have a friend and they want to go to a movie and I want to go to a basketball game, I can sacrifice going to this basketball game so that we go to the movie because I know that they will enjoy it. And I think that that kind of sacrifice will lead to just a much better world. And I think that we need to stop focusing so much on ourselves and focus on other people.
I think people need to hire you as a motivational speaker because you're definitely energizing me for sure. You are an amazing young man, and thank you so much for sharing your amazing story with us, Elijah. We're so happy that you could come on with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking to you.
Elijah Stacey is the author of A Small If. If you would like to find out more about Stacey's organization and get a copy of the book, just go to destroyduchenne.org. It's right there on the screen. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.